The second thing that we wanted to chat about here about football really was just some Dillon Gabriel talk. Corbin, you mentioned to me before we hit record that there's just really no one talking about Dillon Gabriel, mainly because there's no quarterback competition. There's really no measuring stick. There's a true freshman that certainly needs some work. You've got a walk-on behind him, and then Micah Bowens, excuse me. I always flip his name back and forth. Micah Bowens, who, I don't know, there's been a little bit of buzz, some rumors that he might be the number 2 guy right now. I was mocked for that a couple months back. I still don't think it'll stick, but there are some rumors about that. We'll see what happens. But Dillon Gabriel, there's just no measuring stick there to say whether he's good or bad. And I'm kind of curious, Corbin, do you have any type of expectation as far as what type of player you think he'll be as far as success?
That's a great question. It's so hard to put I don't know, it feels like an entire chapter of like these elite Heisman winning quarterbacks at Oklahoma. Like, it's not that we're not getting high-end guys. I think we've proven we are going to continue to do that. But it kind of seems like that chapter's closed. And so then you're just kind of like, I don't know, it's unknown territory, I think, for a lot of OU fans of like what to expect with a guy who has no expectations. And so I really don't know, Adam, just to be totally honest. I have no idea what to expect. I think we've seen him be really, really good, and we've seen him be pretty bad. And so I really don't know. That's a big jump to go from a group of 5 to a Power 5 school. Certainly when we've got a list here, I'm sure you're going to walk through, but certainly there are exceptions, the people who've done well. But for the most part, I'm looking at this list, I'm like, not a good track record of other quarterbacks who've tried to make this jump.
Yeah, so I was curious about that. I was like, how many guys have gone from the group of 5 school to a Power 5 school specifically as a quarterback? It seems like a pretty difficult thing to do, and how many of them have had any type of success? Now, the track record is not super big simply because the transfer portal is brand new. So we're going to see this happen probably a lot more and have a little bit more consistent, data to go on. But just looking at some of the names that came to mind here, De'Aaron King went from Houston to Miami, was a pretty great player at Houston, although his teams really didn't accomplish all that much. In 2018, I think was his best year. The team went 8-5. Major Applewhite got fired. And then he played a few games in 2019 and transferred to the U, Miami, and it was talked about a ton. People thought he was going to raise their ceiling, but
I have no idea why.
He had some injury issues, I think, a little bit, but overall he was solid, but really didn't raise their profile at all. They were kind of what they were before he got there. Yeah. So the other guy that really stood out there also was Gardner Minshew, who was at ECU, was going to transfer to Alabama with the expectation that he really wasn't going to be able to play. And then Mike Leach swooped him up to Washington State. And I think he probably had the most success out of anybody. Washington State had some success before he got there, but I think he did raise their profile. Like, they were a potential fringe playoff candidate that year until I think they lost the season finale against Washington in the Apple Cup. But he finished top 10 in the Heisman voting, is in the NFL right now. So yeah. I think that's probably best case scenario is 10 wins, helps the team reach new heights. Although that's kind of what OU was last year at the same time.
Well, I think the only thing to, kind of counteract, make an exception. I mean, you look at these places they transferred to: Miami, South Carolina, Florida State, Michigan State, Kansas, Washington State, NC State. I mean, none of those teams have anywhere close to the talent that should be in a place like Norman. So you would think if a guy can come in and just simply be solid, that this can be an automatic Big 12 title contender, probably a Big 12 title favorite, and a fringe playoff team. Whether that ends up being true or not, it will be interesting. I mean, there's only one way to find out, and that's going to be here in a few months. But yeah, it's almost kind of again, going back to, we've never really been in this spot. And so it's just kind of like an unknown territory. Dillon wasn't like, a high-end prize recruit type of thing, coming in like a 5-star like we've had multiple times in the past few years. So there's just a ton of question marks. And again, going back to kind of mentioned when we said right before the podcast, nobody's talking about him because he is going to be the starter. Whether he is good or bad, he's going to be the starter. And so we just kind of have to wait and hope that he takes the reins. And a big question for me, I think, on him is going to be, can he stay healthy? Because I think we've all heard enough by now where like what is behind him probably isn't very strong. So I think we kind of ride or die on his health and his, obviously ability to put up good numbers and win games.
Yeah. One thing that I noticed when looking at a lot of these guys that transferred, even some of the other ones that weren't as successful, like a Jason Bean who went from North Texas to Kansas, or maybe a Ryan Finley who went from Boise State to NC State. Although I guess you could say he had some good success. He was drafted in the NFL, but most of those guys went from, really high touchdown numbers to probably they lost 33% of those touchdown numbers. Now their interceptions stayed relatively the same, so that's, I think, an encouraging track record there, that Dillon Gabriel his touchdowns might go down, but his interceptions aren't necessarily going to go up if that track record proves true. So there's some things to look at there. Now, if we say Gardner Minshew is kind of the benchmark, the kind of expectation, which I think is pretty high, I think that was a pretty successful transfer, that story that he had. If Dillon Gabriel matches Gardner Minshew, is that considered a success, or is that kind of expectation?
That's a great question. It's hard to kind of put that around, because I wouldn't put the Pac-12 in the Big 12 category right now as far as just sheer quality of teams.
And maybe it's not fair to say exactly, because Washington State winning 10 games and being a playoff contender is above, their head and what their typical program looks like. So maybe we're saying, hey, just make the playoffs. I think that's probably reasonable.
I mean,
saying,
if Dillon
hey, that's
Gabriel can lead us to the playoffs, I think we'd all be thrilled with that. Yeah, but I don't necessarily see that happening. I think we're a Big 12 title contender. I think that's kind of the ceiling of this team.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye on that and how that develops throughout the season, because I think it is something that's pretty interesting. If Gabriel goes out there and has us win the Big 12, that could quite possibly be the most successful G5 to P5 transition a quarterback has ever had.
Yep.
Because it will take a great effort from him, even despite all the extra talent.
Do you have any thoughts on like what numbers you would expect? Like, take away the wins and losses. If he threw for X, this many touchdowns, like that'd be pretty solid, first year Norman.
Yeah, I would say probably 27 plus touchdowns would be great.
Yeah. Running and throwing?
I would say just passing in that situation. I think we might not see him. I would like to say we won't see him run that much, simply because you mentioned the injury concerns and nothing being behind him. But Jeff Lebby's offenses have had running quarterbacks quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Matt Corral took a beating last year. So I don't know how much he'll actually run there. And then I think it'll be interesting to see too, because Jeff Lebby is more reliant on the running game. So how many opportunities are there going to be for passing yards, passing touchdowns, things like that? So it'll be a little bit different offense that we're just not used to.
Yeah, so I mean, if you take those numbers, let's go back to Spencer Rattler 2020, 3,000 yards passing, 28 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. Certainly a lot of that success came later on in the year.
And that was in 10, 11 games, I think. If it was 2020, there was only...
2020 was less games, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a couple...
So I mean, if you can at minimum match his success from 2020, which I don't think any of us would consider. I think we all thought it ended solidly for Spencer Rattler in 2020.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think all of us were left wanting more, I think, out of that season. So if you consider that the baseline, maybe those expectations are low. Maybe they should be higher.
Yeah. I would say that would be a good season, just knowing that, hey, you've got better defense around you at this point. You've probably got just better overall team. You don't have guys, knock on wood at this point, suspended for the first 6 games of the season. So you might be better set up for success and not have to have as many passing yards trying to come back to win a game, being up, more or less. So I kind of wish we had Tyler on for this last question on Dillon Gabriel, because he would have a strong opinion. But Spencer Sanders, is Dillon Gabriel right now, if you had to rank them today, is he ahead of Spencer Sanders? Because I will say Spencer Sanders has done something that Dillon Gabriel has not to this point in his career, and that's take his team to a conference championship game.
I think you can say you can say right now that Spencer Sanders is better than Dillon Gabriel, but it doesn't mean you would pick him to necessarily lead your team. I think both those teams can coexist. And so I would say, yes, like on paper, Spencer Sanders has much more of a background and much more success than what Dillon Gabriel has. Does that mean I'm going, with everything else considered, full team, coach, all that, does that mean I'm going to take Spencer Sanders in a head to head matchup? No. So I think those are two things that can coexist, is like on paper versus reality. Do you agree?
I would agree. And it's kind of an interesting argument to just looking at the rest of the Big 12. There's not a lot of quarterbacks that I would necessarily even consider ahead. But at the same time, I still want to see Dillon Gabriel against a Power 5 schedule to really say with a ton of confidence. Like, I'm not betting a lot of money on this necessarily, but I mean, Quinn Ewers has all the talent in the world. We haven't seen him play at the college level.
Right.
We don't know who TCU is going to start. Baylor's kind of got some guys that are solid. They're not going to be great. Probably they have a defined ceiling. Texas Tech doesn't know who they're going with. K-State has Adrian Martinez, has a ton of experience, hasn't really done anything with it in his time at Nebraska.
Sure looked good in Norman last year.
He sure did. And then outside of that, though, I mean, who knows who's starting at Kansas, Iowa State, West Virginia. So it's very possible Gabriel could be the best quarterback in the league.
Well, what's interesting, and I was just out of sheer curiosity, I hate to do this to myself. I mean, you look at a few of the quarterbacks Bama has had and who they won a national championship with. And you look last year, like Georgia just won with Stetson Bennett at quarterback, who had less than 3,000 yards passing, 29 touchdowns and 7 interceptions for a college. Like, that's just pretty kind of like, it's good, nothing elite there. So it's not like, now granted, some of those Bama and obviously last year's Georgia defenses were just absolutely ridiculous. Yep. But, you don't need, it helps, but you don't need a strong elite quarterback to win a conference, get in the playoff, win a national championship. It's been proven.
Yeah. I don't want to go down that road too much because this team winning a championship, I don't know if I can get there. Yeah.